Los Angeles is on fire. But this isn't just a natural disaster. Behind the smoke screens, an ancient ritual is underway. A dark cult, the Flame Worshippers, attempts to summon Moloch, the entity that demands fire sacrifice to open a new cycle of dominance and chaos. World leaders, advanced technology, and forgotten prophetic texts converge at this time. The truth is here, hidden among the screams of the flames and the shadows of the hills. Are you ready to find out who really controls the destiny of the world? Don't let them hide it from you. Redeem now the gift I left pinned in the comments and see the evidence that could change everything. But be careful, the truth is darker than you imagine. My name is Lucas Gardner, and today I am a fugitive. I'm writing this in a hurry, not knowing if I'll see the next sunrise. Los Angeles is on fire, but these flames are not like any fire I've seen before. It's not just forests burning, it's the streets, the souls, and something beyond our understanding. What is happening here cannot be attributed to climate change or human failure. This is bigger, much bigger. The first outbreaks appeared as always, small and isolated. The city, accustomed to fire seasons, treated the event with its usual coolness. But I felt something different. The air was heavier, filled with a metallic smell that wasn't just smoke. The vibrant red sky was not just the result of ash in the atmosphere. It was as if the city was under a spell, a stage set for something terrible. As I drove through the streets that first night, an uneasiness came over me. It was no ordinary fear, but a primal feeling, as if something invisible was watching me. Shadows danced strangely on the asphalt, as if the flames in the hills had a life of their own. The animals noticed it too. Dogs barked incessantly. Birds fled in disorganized flocks. Even the winds carried a whisper that seemed to call my name. On the radio, the anchors treated the fires as a consequence of drought and urban neglect. But the more I listened, the more absurd the explanations seemed. I knew what a natural disaster was. I had covered fires before. But this, it had a pattern, a purpose. Each new focus appeared as if following a route drawn by invisible hands. I tried to ignore my instincts the first night, but something changed the next day. I woke up feeling like I had a nightmare, but I couldn't remember the dream. My throat burned, as if I'd breathed in smoke in my sleep, but my house was far from the affected areas. When I left for work, I saw something that didn't make sense. The streets were full of symbols burned into the asphalt. There were no tire tracks or debris. They were circles, ancient runes that glowed in dark ash. I spent the day trying to understand what was happening. I called contacts at the fire department, but they were too busy to answer me. I only heard hurried phrases. "This is out of control. The fire doesn't react as it should." One of them mentioned seeing figures in the middle of the flames. I thought he was delusional, but now I'm not so sure. At the end of the day, as I walked through downtown Los Angeles, I was overcome by a strange feeling. It was as if the city was breathing. The heat from the fire seemed to pulse rhythmically, like the beat of a heart. So I listened. It wasn't the sound of sirens or the roar of fire. It was a deeper sound, a lament that seemed to come from the ground itself. I returned home with my mind in turmoil. My journalistic instinct told me there was something more there. I decided to investigate. That's when I received the first message, an anonymous note left under my door. Just 2 handwritten sentences. "You see what they want to hide. The circle is almost complete." I sat for hours staring at the paper, trying to understand what it meant. Circle. Full. Before I could make any calls, I heard a sound in the backyard. When I went out to check, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A burnt mark in the grass, the same symbol I had seen on the streets. And that's when I realized, these flames were not mere accidents. They were not caused by human carelessness or by nature. They had a purpose. Someone or something was pulling the strings. And whatever it was, it had already started. A week before the first fire, my life was relatively normal, or at least as normal as it could be for an investigative journalist. I was immersed in a story about local corruption, something banal compared to what was about to happen. That night I came home late. The porch light flickered, a quirk I kept putting off fixing. That's when I saw the brown envelope on the floor, right in front of the door. There was no sender, address, or any visible mark. Just my name, Lucas Gardner, scrawled in aggressive, almost desperate handwriting. As I opened the envelope, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Inside, there was a single yellowed piece of paper with a message that seemed like it came from some apocalyptic cult. The circle is complete. They will burn the world to be reborn. I reread the phrase countless times, trying to decipher its meaning, but that wasn't all. There was also a map, clearly old, showing Los Angeles with markings made at 3 locations: the Griffith Observatory, the Orpheum Theater, and a spot in the center that looked like an abandoned church. But what caught my attention most was the symbol in the bottom corner of the map. An owl, drawn in intricate detail, its black eyes as if absorbing everything around it. As I held the map, I felt something strange. It wasn't just the weight of the old paper, but an inexplicable discomfort, as if the object carried something else, something invisible and disturbing. I closed the envelope and threw it on the living room table, convinced it was a bad joke or an attempt to intimidate me. But that night, sleep didn't come. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, the owl symbol continued to hover in my mind. I'd already seen something similar somewhere, perhaps in an old article about secret cults. I decided to research, and what I discovered didn't bring me peace. The owl was associated with an entity called Moloch, mentioned in historical texts as an ancient god, worshipped with human sacrifices and fire rituals. The name seemed out of place, something that belonged in the distant past, but still, there was something unsettlingly current about its presence. The next day, I tried to find out who could have sent the envelope. I asked the janitor if anyone had passed by the building, but he just shrugged. "Nobody that I've seen," he replied, without paying any attention. But something in his expression seemed off, as if he knew more than he was letting on. With the map in hand, I decided to investigate. I started at Griffith Observatory, the first marked location. The landscape, usually full of tourists, was strangely deserted that afternoon. I walked around, trying to understand what was special about that place. It was then that I saw an inscription on the stone, almost invisible in the sunlight. The same owl symbol, discreetly engraved in a corner of the entrance. The restlessness grew. Who had marked these places on the map, and why? I went to the second location, the Orpheum Theater. The building, with its classical facade and decadent atmosphere, seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As I approached, I noticed that the door was ajar, creaking slightly as I pushed it. Inside, the smell of dust mixed with something metallic. On the stage, beneath a thin layer of soot, I saw the owl symbol again, larger this time, as if it were observing empty space. The third point on the map was an abandoned church in the center of the city. I arrived at the place at dusk, when the shadows were beginning to engulf the streets. The church, with broken windows and peeling walls, looked like a monument to oblivion. I entered cautiously, each step echoing through the empty space. On the altar, I found an unlit candle and marks of something burned. There were symbols engraved on the walls, but they were different. Not just the owl, but runes I couldn't understand. While there, a sound from the shadows froze me. It was low and guttural, like a whisper coming from all directions. Something seemed to be watching me, but I couldn't see anything. I ran out, my heart racing, and I swore to myself I wouldn't come back. When I got home that night, the map was back on my desk, as if it had a life of its own. I was sure I had put it in a drawer before leaving. It was then that I understood that this was not a simple coincidence. Someone, or something, was taking me to these places. The question that echoed in my mind was simple: why? But deep down, I already knew the answer. These places were not just marks on the map, they were pieces of a puzzle, a ritual being assembled piece by piece. And now, I was part of it. The Griffith Observatory, which normally offered a stunning view of Los Angeles, looked different that night. The cold air carried an unusual density, as if the city was holding its breath. Street lights flickered in the distance, distorted by smoke rising from the hills. It was as if the horizon was covered by a red veil, hiding something monstrous behind its beauty. As I climbed the steps to the observatory, I felt a presence before I even saw him. Carter was there, leaning against one of the columns, barely visible in the darkness. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that hid most of his face, but it was impossible to miss his eyes. They glowed in a way that made me uncomfortable, as if they were used to seeing secrets that no one else should see. "Lucas Gardner," he said, before I could introduce myself. His voice was deep and drawling, as if each word carried an ancestral weight. "Do you understand what is happening here? Or do you still believe that these flames are just fire?" Before I could respond, he held out a dossier. The leather cover was worn and smelled old, almost putrid. Reluctantly, I took the material, but hesitated to open it. It was then that he spoke again, this time more quietly, as if confiding a deadly secret. "When fire consumes the sky, Luke, it's not just destruction, it's a sacrifice, a calling." I opened the dossier with my hands shaking, and what I saw made me freeze. There were photographs of symbols I recognized, the markings on the map, the runes on the streets, and the stylized owl. But there was more. Images of charred bodies arranged in perfect circles, in places that coincided exactly with the most intense fires, a pattern that no one seemed to have noticed. This can't be real," I stammered. Carter just smiled, a smile that held no joy. "Real or not, it's already started," he replied. "And you were called because there is still time to understand what is coming." He started to explain. The fires were not accidents, but rather an ancient ritual carried out by a group he called the Flame Worshippers. According to him, these cults existed for centuries, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to bring back something forgotten by time, an entity called Moloch. "Moloch?" I repeated, my voice a whisper. The name sounded heavy, like a stone tied to my chest. Carter nodded slowly. "Moloch demands fire, Lucas, always has. They believe that by burning entire cities, they can open a portal, bring the Ancient One back to Earth." His every word seemed to tear apart my perception of reality. I looked around, expecting to see tourists or any sign of normality, but the observatory was empty except for the two of us. Not even the usual sound of the city reached there. It was as if we were isolated in another dimension. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're already involved," he replied, his tone deadpan. "You saw the markings. You know something is wrong. It wasn't a coincidence that the map came to you." For a moment, my mind tried to find some logic, some reason to discredit Carter. Maybe he was just a lunatic with an absurd theory. But at the same time, everything he said made sense. The marks, the shadows, the sounds I heard in the church, they were pieces of a puzzle that I didn't want to put together, but that was already in front of me. Before leaving, Carter handed me one last page. It was an old calendar with a single date marked, August 20th. "If you want to survive," he said, his voice low but firm, "be ready before that day. They won't stop, Lucas. You've seen the fire, but you haven't seen the shadows yet." He disappeared into the darkness before I could ask further. I stood there for a while, staring at the city below me, where the flames seemed to grow and multiply. At that moment, I realized that Carter was right. This wasn't just destruction, it was the prelude to something bigger, something much worse. And now, I had no choice. I was in their game, whether I wanted to or not. Carter's dossier was a window into what was never meant to be seen. As soon as I opened it, I smelled mold and something metallic, like dried blood. The first few pages were black and white photographs, blurry and grainy, but clear enough for me to understand the horror they portrayed. Men and women in black robes, with hoods that hid their faces, surrounded roughly carved stone altars. In the center of each altar, a tall, almost supernatural flame burned. The light was not ordinary. It seemed to writhe, as if it were alive, casting shadows that danced in impossible patterns on the surrounding walls. The owl symbol was everywhere, carved into stones, embroidered on robes, painted on the faces of those who participated. These were no ordinary secret meetings. They were ceremonies, rituals. Carter called them the flame worshippers. In his voice, there was a mix of contempt and fear. He pointed to a note in the corner of one of the pages. The circle will be closed. Rebirth requires sacrifice. The words echoed in my mind, bringing a deep nausea. They follow the Codex Igneus, Carter explained as I leafed through the dossier. An ancient grimoire, lost for centuries, that details how to sacrifice entire cities to summon something called the primordial power, something that should remain buried. There were hand-drawn drawings in the dossier, copies of pages from the Codex. The illustrations showed cities destroyed, not by war or natural disasters, but by fire. Always fire. At the center of each destruction, a shadowy figure emerged from the flames, a gigantic being with glowing eyes and sharp claws. Carter pointed to a Latin caption, "Moloch of fire is reborn. Moloch is reborn by fire." "Who are these people?" I asked, trying to maintain my composure. "And why doesn't anyone know about this?" "Because they're in control," Carter replied with a tone of cold certainty. "World leaders, tycoons, intellectuals. They don't just know, Lucas. They participate. They conduct the rituals. This is how they ensure power and dominance." As he spoke, I looked at more photos. I recognized some of the faces that were partially visible beneath the hoods. Famous politicians, heads of corporations, people I had already interviewed. In one of the images, I saw a man who appeared to be Donald Trump next to a figure resembling Barack Obama. Both were in front of an altar, with their hands raised towards the flame. "It can't be," I whispered, more to myself than to Carter. But he listened. "That's why you received the map," he continued. "You were meant to see this, to connect the pieces. They know you're getting close to the truth, Lucas, and they won't let you go very far." One page in particular left me speechless. It was a diagram of what appeared to be Los Angeles, with points marked in specific locations, the same ones that were on the map I received. There were lines connecting these points, forming a perfect circle. In the center, a single symbol, the owl. "They're using the city as an altar," Carter explained, his tone now almost fatalistic. "Each fire is part of the ritual. Every life lost fuels the sacrifice." There was something in Carter's look that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Before I could press him, he handed me another sheet. It was a copy of a page from the Codex Igneus. She described the final ritual. When the circle is complete and the fire consumes the last altar, the portal will be opened. The primordial will walk among us again. "And what happens next?" I asked, my voice shaking. Carter took a moment to respond, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the flames still lit up the night. "After this, Lucas, the world will no longer be ours." As I closed the dossier, I felt a crushing weight on my shoulders. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too terrible to accept. Something was coming, something ancient, cruel and hungry. "Are you saying they're going to let the whole city burn?" I asked. Carter just nodded. "It's not just a city, Lucas. Los Angeles is the beginning. There are others marked. Tokyo, New York, London. They are testing, refining the ritual." The idea that so many lives were just pawns in a power game made me sick. The fire was not the end, but the beginning of something much worse. And I knew, at that moment, that there was no going back. Moloch. The sound of that name seemed to whisper in my mind, even after Carter said it. It was as if the word carried a weight that no language should bear. I felt a chill run up my spine, an instinctive reaction that seemed to come from an ancestral fear, something engraved in the bones of humanity for millennia. "Moloch," he repeated, with a gravity that made the air around us seem thicker. "Who or what is Moloch?" I asked, even though part of me wished Carter wouldn't answer. He sighed, as if the explanation itself were a curse. "Moloch is a primordial entity, Lucas. Long before organized religions existed, he was worshipped. A god of fire, destruction, and rebirth. Your price? Blood and human lives. It's always been like that." The idea seemed absurd and terrifying at the same time. We were in the 21st century, a world guided by science and reason. But something about the way Carter spoke, as if he himself had seen Moloch or felt his presence, made me believe it, or at least fear it was true. He opened the dossier again, showing a series of old engravings. The first showed a colossal statue of Moloch, a being with a humanoid body and the head of an owl, empty eyes that seemed to observe the viewer. This image comes from the Bronze Age. Cults of Moloch flourished in ancient civilizations, such as the Carthaginians and the Canaanites. They said he demanded sacrifices by fire. It's not a legend, Lucas. There are records of children being burned alive as offerings. I closed my eyes, trying to erase the images Carter painted, but he continued, undeterred. And don't think that this is in the past. The cult of Moloch never died. He just adapted. It became more subtle, more sophisticated. Today, he doesn't need small villages. He has entire cities at his disposal. The idea hit me like a punch. Are you saying that these people, these elites, believe they are invoking an ancient god? Carter looked at me, his eyes serious. They don't believe it, Lucas. They know. For them, Moloch is not a myth. It is a real entity. And they believe that by feeding him the souls of an entire city, he will reward them with absolute power. I went back to the dossier, almost against my will. One page described what appeared to be a ritual. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but the diagrams were clear. A circle of fire, bodies placed in specific patterns, and in the center, the silhouette of Moloch emerging from the flames. Every detail seemed carefully planned, like a macabre equation designed to open something that was never meant to be opened. And why Los Angeles? I asked. The city, with all its grandeur and decadence, seemed an unlikely place for such an ancient ritual. But Carter shook his head, as if my question was naive. Los Angeles is perfect, Lucas. It is a city built on illusions, a city that attracts dreams, but consumes them as fuel. Glamour and decadence side by side, and with so many hearts beating in despair, so many souls losing themselves in the search for fame, the sacrifice is all the more powerful. I felt nauseous. The streets I knew so well, the bright lights of Hollywood, the alleys filled with dark stories. It was all part of an altar, a board for a cruel game I was barely beginning to understand. And the flames you see now, Carter continued, are just the beginning. Each fire is like a marker, activating a part of the circle. When the last point is connected, the ritual is complete, and Moloch will walk among us again. His words seemed impossible, but at the same time, something inside me knew they were true. The fires, the symbols, the secret meetings, they all pointed to something big, something terrible, and I was at the center of it, without knowing why. Carter leaned in closer, as if needing to emphasize his next sentence. They won't stop, Lucas. They have already started the ritual, and when Moloch is reborn, there will be nothing we can do to stop him. I looked toward the horizon, where the hills burned like living torches. The flames danced strangely, as if they were puppets of an invisible master. For the first time, I felt that hell was not just a religious concept. He was here, among us, growing with each new flame. Carter collected the dossier, but his words continued to echo in my mind long after he left. The name of Moloch was forbidden for a reason, Luke, but they brought him back, and now he wants more. The flames in Los Angeles were unlike any I'd ever seen. They did not obey natural laws. There were no winds to direct them, nor enough dry vegetation to explain their ferocity. However, the fires advanced with disturbing precision, as if guided by invisible hands, drawing a circle around the city. Each burn point seemed to have a purpose, a specific place in the larger pattern. I spent hours comparing the maps in Carter's dossier with the fire reports, and the coincidences were impossible to ignore. Each new focus corresponded to one of the points marked on the old map. It wasn't a straight line of destruction. It was a meticulous dance, each movement contributing to completing the perfect circle. There were just a few stitches left to close it, and something inside me knew that when that happened, it would be too late. As I investigated, I heard disturbing reports from rescue teams and firefighters. At the central station, a young firefighter named Morales recounted his experience, his eyes wide, his voice shaking. "I swear, I saw something in there," he said, pointing toward the burning hills. Shadows, people walking through fire. But they didn't scream. They didn't run. It was like they were dancing. His words chilled me. Others confirmed the same thing, each report grimmer than the last. A veteran firefighter went missing during a mission, and his partner, when rescued, was in a state of shock. All he could say was, "They took him. The shadows took him." I tried to understand what that meant. Could these shadows be the flame worshippers? Were they performing their rituals directly in the affected areas? Or were these figures something worse, something I still didn't understand? I started hearing stories from residents of the evacuated areas. People reported strange sounds in the middle of the night before their homes were engulfed in flames. They were low whispers, like chants, coming from inside the forests. Others said they saw glowing eyes in the middle of the fire, staring, watching. One man reported that, shortly before evacuating, he found symbols engraved on the outside wall of his home, as if someone had marked the spot for the sacrifice. I knew I needed to get closer. I drove to one of the burned areas, an area that had already been evacuated and closed off by firefighters. The smell of ash and burning flesh was almost unbearable, but I continued. The ground was hot, and the air seemed to vibrate, as if the earth were alive. I found a clearing where the fire had passed, but something seemed wrong. There were marks on the ground, not just burns, but symbols etched into the earth. They formed concentric circles, with the owl symbol in the center. While photographing the marks, I heard a distant sound. It was low, rhythmic, almost like a drum, but with a tone that seemed to come from inside my head. I felt my body freeze, my mind begging me to run away, but my legs refused to move. Then, in the distance, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. A figure, tall and indistinct, walked among the still hot embers. It wasn't a reflection, nor a trick of the light. The figure did not move like a human being. Each step seemed to bend the reality around him, as if the air rippled with his presence. She stopped, turned to me, and for an instant, I was sure her eyes met mine. They didn't shine like human eyes. They were two incandescent cracks, like holes opening into a deep hell. I ran like never before. I didn't care about the noise I made, or if someone would catch me for trespassing in the closed area. All that mattered was getting away from that thing, that presence. When I got back to my car, my hands were shaking so much that it took me several minutes to start it. As I drove back to town, one thought haunted me. What I saw was not human. It couldn't be. Later that night, Carter called me. His voice, normally calm and collected, was strained. "You saw something, didn't you, Lucas?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. I think so," I stammered, trying to keep my sanity. "They're not shadows, Lucas," he said. "They are emissaries. They are preparing the ground for Moloch, and you saw what happens to those who get too close." I closed my eyes, trying to erase the images from my mind, but there was no forgetting. The flames weren't just consuming Los Angeles. They were bringing something to the surface, something old, something hungry. The fire continued to engulf Los Angeles, turning the city into a living hell. The destruction seemed to follow a purpose, but what? As I reviewed the maps and reports, Carter called again, his voice thick with urgency. "Lucas, are you ready to see what's really going on?" He didn't wait for my answer. "Get ready. This will change everything." That night, he appeared with an even darker expression than usual. Without saying a word, he handed me a tablet. On the screen, a grainy recording of a recent event. I recognized the location, one of the most luxurious hotels in Los Angeles, where high-level meetings were often held. "See," Carter muttered, as the image showed a packed conference room. It was an apparently formal meeting, full of well-known figures. Among them, Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and other global leaders, many of whom had already made headlines around the world. Officially, that event was a tribute to former President Jimmy Carter, but something seemed out of place. The recording changed to a forensic lip reading. Carter paused the video and pointed to the transcript at the bottom of the screen. The words that emerged sent an icy chill down my spine. When the fire purifies, the new world will emerge. I looked at Carter in disbelief. Are you saying they are behind this? He nodded slowly. These words, Lucas, are not a coincidence. They are not metaphors. They know what's going on. More than that, they are allowing it to happen. I continued watching the recording, feeling my stomach drop every second. The conversation between Trump and Obama seemed strangely relaxed, almost as if they were laughing about a shared secret. A lip-reading expert translated more parts of the dialogue. "We're close now," Trump said. "Everything is in place," Obama responded. "Los Angeles will be the first step," added Trump with a disconcerting smile. "First step to what?" I asked, feeling sweat running down my face. Carter took a deep breath before responding. "For something called the New Dawn. They believe they can create a new world, but to do so, they need to destroy the old one, and the fire ritual is the key." The words seemed insane, but the recording continued. Other leaders participated in the conversation, speaking in complicit tones. Each one mentioned a different location: New York, London, Tokyo. It was as if Los Angeles was just the beginning of a much bigger plan. Later, the recording showed something even more disturbing. The meeting ended with a kind of toast. Everyone raised their glasses, but instead of a typical speech, a man whose identity was impossible to discern said something in a somber and ceremonial tone. "To the ancients, may their flames light the way to the new dawn." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to process what I'd just seen. It was as if I had witnessed a pact, a conspiracy so vast it bordered on the absurd. But at the same time, it all made sense. The fire, the patterns, the shadows, everything was connected. "Why would they do that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Carter didn't hesitate. "Power, Lucas. It's always about power. They believe they can summon something that will make them immortal, invincible, and they are willing to sacrifice everything, even humanity, to achieve this." He then showed another recording. This time, it was the exit from the event. As the global leaders dispersed, a hooded figure approached one of them. It was not possible to see his face under the hood, but he handed a small object, which looked like some kind of amulet, to one of those present. Carter froze the video and enlarged the image. It was the owl symbol. "They're all involved," Carter said, almost in a whisper, "and everyone has a role to play in the ritual. Moloch not only demands sacrifice, he demands absolute obedience, and they gave their loyalty." I looked at the video again. In the last scene, as the hooded figures disappeared into the darkness, the hills around Los Angeles seemed to glow with a reddish light. It wasn't just the flames. It was something deeper, something alive. "The new dawn," I muttered, the words feeling like acid in my mouth. "Don't fool yourself, Lucas," Carter said. "When they talk about rebirth, it's not for us. It's for them. And once that starts, there will be no turning back." Suddenly I realized the true terror of that night. The flames were not the end point, but the beginning of something none of us were prepared to face. The Orpheum Theater had always been a Los Angeles landmark, with its grand architecture and aura of old-time glamour. But that night, following Carter's map, I saw the building with different eyes. There were no bright lights or tourists, just a shadowy structure that seemed to crumble under the weight of something invisible. The facade was partially covered in soot, as if the fire from the hills had reached out its fingers to mark the spot. As he pushed open the main door, a creak echoed through the empty space. The feeling of crossing that threshold was suffocating, as if the theater itself was trying to expel me. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of dust and mold and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. My heart pounded as I walked through the lobby, where dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling, the crystals swaying slightly, even though the air was still. The main room was immense, but it seemed compressed by darkness. The rows of old worn chairs were covered in a blanket of dust, but that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the stage, illuminated by a beam of light that seemed to appear from nowhere, was a circle of black stones, meticulously arranged. Each of the stones was engraved with runes that I didn't recognize, but that looked familiar, as if I'd seen them in a forgotten nightmare. I approached the stage, hesitantly. The stones emanated a faint heat, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin tingle. As I leaned in to look at the runes, I realized they weren't just engraved. They looked alive. It was as if they pulsed lightly, each emitting a faint red glow, synchronized with a rhythm that I felt more than heard. In the center of the circle, a vision transfixed me, a statue of Moloch. The demonic owl was immense, nearly 2 meters tall. His eyes, black as abysses, seemed to absorb all the light around them. Every detail of the statue was intricate. The carved feathers looked real, as if they could cut to the touch. The sharp claws gripped a stone globe, symbolizing absolute dominance. For a moment, the room felt alive. The runes glowed more intensely, and the statue's eyes seemed to watch me, analyze me. I tried to shake the thought away, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that Moloch was present, that this statue was not just a representation, but a vessel. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was low and rhythmic, like a drum beat coming from beneath the stage. The sound began to grow, each beat echoing through the empty theater. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but then I realized something even more disturbing. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It came from the stones themselves. I tried to move away, but something held me there, not physically, but mentally. It was as if my mind was being drawn into the circle, into Moloch's eyes. Visions began to fill my head. Cities on fire, crowds screaming as shadows danced among them, and at the center of it all, that colossal figure emerging from the fire. I woke up suddenly, lying on the stage floor as if I'd passed out. Still panting after getting up from the stage floor, I tried to organize my thoughts. The theater felt more oppressive than before, the shadows around me pulsing with a life of their own. The runes on the black stones continued to glow, flickering between shades of red and gold, as if they were attuned to something I couldn't see. The statue of Moloch in the center seemed more imposing, and its black eyes reflected a light that shouldn't be there. When I took the first step to leave, I heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. Whispers. They weren't human voices, I was sure of that. They didn't come from a single place, but seemed to spread across the walls, the floor, the very air around me. The words were in languages I didn't recognize, but they seemed to slip into my mind, leaving an uncomfortable echo. "Who's there?" My voice came out weak, barely a whisper on its own. The sound reverberated in the empty room, but the only response was a chorus of soft, unsettling laughter that seemed to mock me. The whispers grew louder, now in harmony with the beats I had heard before, as if the theater itself had a heart and it was speeding up. I tried to stay calm and turned toward the hallway that led to the exit, but a shiver ran down my spine. Something was behind me. I felt a touch on my shoulder, cold as ice. I turned instinctively, but there was no one. Just emptiness, the air heavy with sulfur, and the shadows that seemed denser, closer. The laughter stopped, and a single voice whispered, "Lucas, you shouldn't be here." I froze. I didn't know if that was coming from inside my head or from the theater itself. The smell of sulfur became stronger, almost unbearable, burning my nostrils. The stage seemed to pulse as if something was trying to get out from under it. And then I realized the symbols on the stones now glowed brightly, as if reacting to my presence. I took a step back, but I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet. It was then that I saw the shadows. There were no reflections or plays of light. They moved independently, wriggling and sliding along walls and chairs. One of them looked bigger, denser, almost human, but its shape was wrong, distorted, as if it couldn't maintain a fixed structure. "Lucas," the voice repeated, now louder, closer. The runes on the stones began to glow brightly, and the entire room seemed to spin. For a moment, I looked again at the statue of Moloch, and I swore it had moved. The claws holding the stone globe seemed tighter, and the eyes glowed a fiery red. That's when something changed. The shadows began to approach, slowly but with determination. Their every step seemed to suck the heat from the air, and my mind screamed to run away. My feet were trapped, as if the room itself was holding me, but with an almost superhuman effort, I managed to free myself. I ran to the exit, tripping over chairs and almost falling more than once. The voices increased in intensity, now shouting, calling out my name. "Lucas, you saw too much." They seemed to tear the air, but I kept running. When I finally reached the main door, I pushed it open, and the cold night enveloped me like a hug of relief. Outside, I turned to look at the theater. The windows were dark, the doors were still, as if nothing had happened, but I knew something had followed me. I could feel it. It wasn't physical, but it was there, lurking, like a shadow I could never escape. On the way back to the apartment, the feeling of being watched never went away. It was as if something had crossed a barrier with me, something that I had awakened when entering that place. When I finally got home and locked the door, my mind was still in chaos. The voices, the symbols, the shadows. Everything seemed like a piece of a puzzle that I didn't want to put together, but that was now inevitably in front of me. My phone vibrated. It was Carter. "You were at the theater, weren't you?" His voice was deep, full of concern. "Yes," I replied, almost voiceless. "And now you understand. They know who you are. They know you saw it. Get ready, Lucas. This is just the beginning." I looked at the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but to me, they looked like flames from a fire that would never be put out. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows of the Orpheum Theater were still with me, in the dark corners of my apartment, in the distorted reflections of the windows. The phone was still in my hand, Carter on the other end, his deep voice echoing in my mind. "Lucas, you need to understand," he said, almost whispering. What he saw in the theater was not just a symbol or a coincidence. It was a demonstration. The ritual is underway, and you are at the center of it now. Before I could ask further, he paused, as if considering how much he was willing to reveal to me. "There is something you need to read, a text called the Fiery Code. But I warn you, what's in it may break your mind." He hung up, leaving me alone with a suffocating feeling that something invisible was watching me. I went straight to the computer. Even exhausted, the need for answers was stronger than fear. I looked for any mention of the Fiery Code. At first, I only found fragments, conspiracy theories on obscure forums. But then, in a forgotten corner of the internet, there was a digitized file, marked with a warning, prohibited text, read at your own risk. My hand hesitated over the mouse. Part of me wanted to shut everything down and pretend I had never encountered it, but another part knew it was already too late. I clicked. The screen went dark for a moment before the text appeared. The first pages were covered in symbols that resembled theater runes, accompanied by grotesque illustrations. Bodies arranged in precise patterns, flames consuming entire buildings, and, repeatedly, the figure of Moloch emerging from the fire. One particular passage caught my attention, written in Latin. It took me a while to translate, but when I finally understood, I felt a chill so deep I could barely breathe. "Burn the earth, offer the blood, and he will walk among us again." The words were simple, but carried with a terrible promise. I continued reading, each sentence more disturbing than the last. The text detailed how to sacrifice entire cities to open portals between dimensions, using fire as a conductor. Each death, each scream, fueled the ritual, strengthening the circle until it was complete. The description of the final ritual was detailed, almost scientific. They needed key points in a city, each representing a pillar of sacrifice. When these points were marked by fire and connected in a perfect circle, a portal would open, and then Moloch would walk among us again. What terrified me most was realizing that the instructions coincided exactly with the fires in Los Angeles. The pattern, the circle, it all made sense now. Fire was not just destruction, it was a call, an offer. The following pages of codex described the consequences. The portal, once opened, would bring not only Moloch, but an army of shadows, the same beings I'd seen in the theater. They were not just servants, they were extensions of Moloch, each a fraction of his power and evil. Suddenly, the air in my apartment felt heavy. The smell of sulfur returned, stronger than ever, and I felt an invisible pressure around me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the text, but the words started to blur together. The letters seemed to move, pulsing as if they were alive. I heard a sound behind me, a slight shuffling, as if something or someone was moving in the hallway. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I went back to the computer, but the screen flickered, briefly showing something that wasn't in the text. It was an image of the statue of Moloch, his eyes shining, fixed on me. I blinked, and the image disappeared, replaced by codex. But now, the final words on the page were burned into my mind. When the circle is complete, no man, God, or time can stop the rebirth. I stood up suddenly, feeling an urgency that bordered on desperation. I picked up the phone and dialed Carter. He answered on the third ring. "You read it, didn't you?" he asked. No need for confirmation. "It's all there, Carter," I said, my voice shaking. "The fires, the circle, Moloch, they are following the ritual exactly as described. But what if the circle closes? What happens then?" He hesitated before responding. "So, Luke, Moloch will not be just a statue. He will be flesh, fire and shadow, and the world as we know it will be consumed." The silence between us was deafening, filled only by the echo of the man's words. Codex in my mind. And I knew, at that moment, that the circle was almost complete. Still holding the phone, with Carter on the other end of the line, my heart was racing as I tried to absorb what he had just told me. The fiery code had confirmed the ritual, the fires, and the rebirth of Moloch. But even so, there was a missing piece of the puzzle, something that explained how they were managing to manipulate fire and earth in such a precise, so calculated way. "Lucas," Carter said, interrupting my whirlwind of thoughts, "there's something you don't know yet, something that connects all of this, Tesla, Moloch, and the fires. Are you ready to listen?" "I have no choice, Carter. Speak." He started. "Have you ever heard of John Trump? He was Donald Trump's uncle, a brilliant scientist. He worked at MIT. When Nikola Tesla died in 1943, the FBI confiscated all of his documents, worried about what they might contain. And guess who was called in to analyze them? The information hit me like lightning." "John Trump?" "Exactly," Carter confirmed. "The official files say he found nothing significant in Tesla's papers. But this is a lie. Tesla was years, perhaps centuries, ahead of his time. He had designs for devices that could manipulate energy on a large scale, machines that could alter the weather, create storms, or ultimately, awaken forces that should remain dormant." My mind started spinning, connecting the information, the ritual described in the fiery code. I needed energy at absurd levels to activate the circle. But what if they were using these technologies to amplify the fires, to create conditions that would allow Moloch to be reborn? "Carter, are you saying they are using Tesla's designs to activate the ritual?" "I'm saying it's more than that," he replied. "They're not just activating the ritual, they are controlling every aspect of it. Every fire, every movement of the fire. None of this is natural, it's all planned." He then sent me a file. When I opened it, it was a copy of a declassified document that detailed Tesla's findings and John Trump's involvement. Among the projects was something called Earth Oscillator. The description said that the device was capable of creating vibrations so powerful that they could alter the Earth's crust in specific areas. It was the perfect weapon to awaken the Earth, exactly as described in the fiery code. Most disturbing was the direct connection to Donald Trump. There were leaked emails showing that, decades later, he had access to these projects through his uncle. An excerpt from one of these emails said, "Tesla's technologies are the key to shaping the world. The new dawn needs these tools to ensure the ritual is complete." I stood frozen, trying to process what I had just read. It was like everything was finally connecting. The fires were not just a sacrifice. They were a demonstration of power, a rehearsal for something much greater. Carter, that explains the patterns, the shadows, everything. Exactly, he replied. And there's more. Tesla believed that the universe was made of frequencies, and that certain vibrations could open portals to other dimensions. He called this the universal resonant wave. And guess what the ritual of Codex mentioned? I mentally turned over the words I'd read in the manuscript. Portals. They want to open a portal. Yes, Carter said, his tone grave. And these machines, along with fire, are the perfect tools for this. They are bending the laws of physics, using technologies we have not even begun to understand, to bring something back that should never come back. Suddenly, an image invaded my mind. The statue of Moloch in the Orpheum Theater, his eyes glowing like two embers. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning, a harbinger of what was to come. What about Donald Trump? I asked, trying not to let my voice crack. What is his role in all of this? Trump is more than a politician, Lucas, Carter responded. He is a pawn, but also a player. He knows what he's doing. The new dawn is the ultimate goal, and it is one of the pillars that keeps the plan moving forward. The story is just beginning, but you're not ready for what's coming next. The ritual is underway. The secrets of the elite have been exposed, but the worst is yet to come. What's hidden in the shadows? What is the new dawn? To find out how this tale of fire, sacrifice, and power unfolds, write in the comments, part 02, and uncover the truth they don't want you to know. And before you continue, subscribe to the channel now to ensure you don't miss the next chapters of this dark and chilling story. Also, don't forget to claim the exclusive gift waiting for you in the pinned comment below. It may reveal more than you expect.